The shelter was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on everything inside. The long, narrow hallway smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, a scent that had become too familiar to those who worked there. Rows of metal cages lined the walls, each holding a dog with a different story. Some wagged their tails hopefully. Others cowered in the corners, too afraid to even look up. The air was thick with a mix of loneliness and desperation. This was the last stop for many of them, a place where hope was often short-lived. Staff members moved through the aisles, their expressions unreadable, but there was an unspoken understanding among them. Not every dog here would make it out. Some would be lucky, adopted into warm, loving homes. Others wouldn't be so fortunate. In the farthest corner of the shelter, separated from the more lively and adoptable dogs, lay a German Shepherd. Unlike the others who barked for attention or pressed their noses against the bars in curiosity, this one didn't move. His body was curled tightly in the corner of the cage, his ribs visible beneath a dull, matted coat. His breathing was slow, almost labored, and his eyes remained closed as if the world around him no longer mattered. A single tag hung from the front of his cage, marked with a date. It was tomorrow. That was the deadline. If no one claimed him, if no miracle happened, he wouldn't see another sunrise. A few staff members passed by, glancing at him with quiet resignation. He had been brought in days ago, found injured and alone on the streets. No microchip, no collar, no signs that anyone was looking for him. At first, they had tried to get him to eat, to respond, to show even the slightest will to fight. But he remained still, never growling, never whining, just existing in the space between life and giving up. The injuries on his body had already started healing, but the real wounds, the ones hidden inside, ran much deeper. It was as if he had already decided that there was no reason to go on. One of the newer volunteers stopped outside his cage, a frown tugging at her lips. She crouched down, pressing her fingers lightly against the cold bars. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft but unsure. The dog didn't move, didn't lift his head, or even flick an ear in acknowledgement. He had shut the world out. The volunteer sighed, reading the tag again, her chest tightening at the thought of what would happen in less than 24 hours. She reached into the small pouch at her side, pulling out a treat, hoping to at least get some kind of response. She held it near the bars, waiting. Nothing. She stayed there for another moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. "You're not even going to try, are you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. But as she turned to leave, just for a split second, something changed. It was barely noticeable, but there, a flicker of movement, a faint shift of his paw against the cold metal floor. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there still something left inside him, something buried so deep that even he had forgotten it was there? She didn't know. But what she did know was that tomorrow it wouldn't matter. Because tomorrow his time would be up. The small office at the back of the shelter was dimly lit, the only sound being the soft scratching of a pen against paper. Two staff members sat at the desk, flipping through a stack of files, their expressions unreadable. They had done this too many times before. It never got easier, but it had become routine. The German Shepherd's file lay open in front of them, his intake details written in neat, precise handwriting. No owner, no identification, severe malnourishment, multiple untreated wounds, aggressive behavior, none, responsive, none, adoptability, low. One of them sighed, tapping the paper with the back of her pen. "He hasn't moved in days," she muttered, shaking her head. "Won't eat, won't respond. He's not even trying." The other staff member, a man who had been working here for years, leaned back in his chair. "It's always the quiet ones," he said. "The fighters, they bark, they growl, they make it clear they want to live. But the ones like him, they've already given up." He glanced toward the hallway where the dog's cage was located. "Keeping him here isn't fair. We can't save them all." A long silence stretched between them, neither wanting to be the one to say it out loud. Finally, the woman reached for the stack of forms on the desk, her fingers hesitating for just a second before pulling one free. It was routine, just another name on a list. She placed the paper in front of her and clicked her pen. "All right," she murmured. "Let's put him down for tomorrow." The man nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'll let Dr. Harris know." He pushed his chair back and stood up, stretching his arms before walking toward the door. At least he won't have to suffer anymore. Back in the hallway, the shelter remained eerily quiet. The dogs in the nearby cages had already learned to recognize these moments. The hushed tones, the exchanged glances, the paperwork. They didn't bark this time. They just watched. The German Shepherd, still curled in the corner of his cage, didn't react as the man walked by. He didn't lift his head, didn't flinch, didn't seem to notice at all. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. The next morning, everything was ready. The paperwork was signed, the procedure scheduled. The same staff member who had filled out the form the night before walked down the aisle, stopping in front of the German Shepherd's cage. She knelt, pressing her fingers lightly against the bars, watching for any sign of movement. There was none. "Poor guy," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She stood up and turned to leave, ready to move on to the next task. But just as she stepped away, something stopped her. A sound, faint, barely more than a whisper. She turned back, heart pounding. The German Shepherd hadn't lifted his head, hadn't moved, but his breathing had changed, just slightly. And there, in the dim light of the shelter, she saw it, the smallest twitch of his tail. A movement so weak it could have been imagined. But it was there, and for the first time in days, she hesitated. Emma had only been at the shelter for a few weeks, but she had already seen more heartbreak than she ever expected. She had come in with the hope of saving lives, of making a difference, but reality had set in quickly. Not every dog made it out. Some came in too broken, too far gone, and no matter how much the staff cared, there were limits to what could be done. It was hard, but she told herself she had to get used to it. It was part of the job. Still, there were moments that stuck with her. The way certain dogs looked at her, the quiet ones who didn't bark or whimper, just lay there waiting for whatever came next. Those were the ones who got to her the most. The ones who had lost hope. That morning, as she walked down the row of cages, clipboard in hand, she paused in front of the German Shepherd. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone had. He was the dog no one could reach, the one who had given up long before he even arrived. The paperwork had already been processed. By the end of the day, he wouldn't be here anymore. Emma crouched down, resting her arms on her knees as she studied him. His fur was dull and matted, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat. He didn't react to her presence, didn't lift his head or acknowledge that someone was watching him. If not for the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, he could have been mistaken for a dog that had already left this world. She exhaled, pressing her lips together as she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small biscuit. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, extending it toward the bars. "You hungry?" Nothing, not even a twitch. Emma sighed, lowering her hand. It wasn't a surprise. The other staff had already tried. He wasn't interested in food. He wasn't interested in anything. She was about to stand up and move on when something stopped her. A feeling, more than anything. She looked at him again, really looked this time. His body was still, almost unnaturally so, but there was something else. Something in his posture, in the way he was curled up so tightly, as if trying to make himself as small as possible. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper. For a long moment, she didn't move. And then, slowly, painfully, the dog shifted just slightly. His head didn't lift, his body didn't change, but his eyes, dull, tired, lifeless, opened. Just a little. Just enough. And they met hers. Emma's breath caught. It was only a second, maybe even less, but it was there. A flicker. A connection. A silent, desperate plea buried beneath layers of exhaustion and pain. It was enough. Her fingers tightened around the treat. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Emma didn't hesitate. She turned away from the cage and walked straight toward the main office, her heart pounding. Dr. Harris, the head vet, was at his desk, flipping through files, his expression neutral, unreadable. He had been working at the shelter for years, had seen more cases like this than Emma could imagine. He wasn't cruel, just practical. There were too many dogs and not enough space, not enough resources, not enough time. She knew what he was going to say before she even opened her mouth. Still, she had to try. "I need you to hold off on the euthanasia for the German Shepherd," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Dr. Harris didn't even look up. "Emma, we've been through this. He's not responding. He's not improving. We can't keep pushing resources into a case with no progress." "He made eye contact with me," she said quickly. "Just now. It wasn't much, but it was something. I think there's still fight left in him." The vet finally glanced up, giving her a tired but patient look. "Emma," he said, his voice softer now, "eye contact isn't enough. He hasn't moved in days. We've tried. I know it's hard, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them go." Emma shook her head. "Not yet. Give me one more day. Just 24 hours. If nothing changes, I won't argue. But I need to try." Dr. Harris sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You really think he has a chance?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want to find out." A long pause. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. "All right. One day. That's all." Emma didn't waste time. She went straight back to the cage and sat down on the cold floor beside it, close enough for the dog to see her, but not too close to make him feel threatened. She pulled out a small piece of food, holding it near the bars, her voice soft, steady. "I know you're tired," she murmured. "I know you don't want to try anymore. But you're not alone, okay? You don't have to do this alone." The dog didn't move. His breathing was slow, his body limp, as if he hadn't even heard her. Emma didn't leave. She stayed there, her back against the cold metal, speaking in quiet, soothing tones. She talked about nothing and everything: the weather, the other dogs, the way she had always wanted a German Shepherd when she was a kid. She talked as if he was listening, even though she wasn't sure he was. Minutes passed. The treat in her hand remained untouched. The dog didn't respond, but she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Emma stayed. Hours passed, the quiet hum of the shelter filling the space between her words. The other dogs had settled for the night, their restless pacing replaced by soft breathing and the occasional rustle of movement. The German Shepherd remained curled in the same position, unmoving, unresponsive. Emma's legs were stiff from sitting on the cold floor. Her back ached, but she didn't leave. She kept talking, her voice low, calm. She didn't know if he understood her words, but she hoped he could hear something in her tone, something safe, something different from whatever had made him shut down in the first place. She shifted slightly, stretching out her legs, her hand still holding the small piece of food near the bars. "You don't have to do anything," she murmured. "I just want you to know someone's here. That's all." For a while, nothing changed. The slow rise and fall of his ribs, the dull emptiness in his half-closed eyes. The quiet sound of his breathing was the only sign that he was still with her. Emma sighed, rubbing her eyes. She had seen shut-down dogs before. It was like they had already left, even when their bodies were still there. She knew the signs, and then, so faint she almost missed it, his tail moved. Just barely. A twitch, a flicker, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for a muscle spasm. But Emma saw it. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around the treat. "That's it," she whispered. "I see you." He didn't lift his head. He didn't shift his body. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just sitting beside an empty shell. There was something still there, buried beneath exhaustion and fear. A tiny ember that hadn't completely gone out. Emma leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. She didn't move, didn't rush. She just stayed. The night stretched on. The shelter grew colder, the quiet settling in deeper. She adjusted her position, shifting against the hard floor, but never once leaving. Occasionally, she dozed off, her head resting against her arms, but every time she opened her eyes, she found him in the same spot. And each time, she whispered softly, letting him know she was still there. By the time the first light of morning crept through the shelter's small windows, Emma's body was stiff, her limbs aching from hours of sitting in the same position. But she didn't care. She wasn't leaving until he gave her a real reason to. And for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, he would. Emma barely noticed the stiffness in her legs anymore. She had spent the night beside the cage, her body aching from the cold floor, but she didn't care. The German Shepherd hadn't moved much, but he was still there, still breathing. And she had seen it, the tiny flicker of his tail, the smallest sign that something inside him hadn't completely given up. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her sitting there, waiting, hoping. The morning light was creeping into the shelter when it happened. At first, she thought she imagined it. A tiny shift, a slight movement in his front paw. She straightened, her pulse quickening. His breathing changed, becoming just a little heavier, a little deeper. Then, slowly, painfully, he shifted his weight, his body trembling as he tried to move. Emma didn't breathe. His head lifted just barely. His ears twitched. And then, with a deep, shaky breath, he tried to push himself up. His legs wobbled, his muscles too weak to hold him. But he was trying. He was trying. Emma's eyes stung as she whispered, "That's it. Come on, buddy." The dog's body shook violently, his ribs visible under his thin coat, but he kept going. His front paws pushed against the floor, his back legs struggling to follow. It wasn't graceful, wasn't strong, but it was something. He let out a soft, raspy whimper, his eyes barely open, but they found Emma's. And in that moment, she knew. He wasn't done. He wasn't giving up. A noise from behind made her turn. She hadn't noticed the shelter staff gathering near the doorway, watching in stunned silence. They had all seen him at his worst, had accepted that he was too far gone. But now, as they stood there, watching the dog who was supposed to have no hope struggle to his feet, there was nothing but disbelief in their eyes. One of them whispered, "I can't believe it." But Emma could. She had believed it all along. The shelter had changed in an instant. Just hours ago, the German Shepherd had been another hopeless case, another dog whose time was running out. Now he was standing, barely, weak and unsteady, but standing. The staff moved quickly, gathering supplies, whispering among themselves about what had just happened. No one had expected this. No one had thought he had it in him. Emma stayed close, her hands gripping the cold metal bars as she watched him. His body trembled with effort, his breathing heavy, but there was something different in his eyes now. A flicker of life. Dr. Harris stepped forward, holding a scanner in his hand. "Let's see if he has a microchip," he said, his voice quieter than usual. No one had bothered checking before. It hadn't seemed necessary. Dogs like him, abandoned and injured, rarely had a past worth tracing. But now, after what they had just seen, they had to know. Emma held her breath as the scanner moved over the dog's shoulder. For a second, nothing happened. Then a beep. The room went still. Dr. Harris frowned, glancing at the small screen. A number flashed across it, a registration code linked to something or someone. He didn't say a word as he stepped over to the computer, typing quickly, his expression unreadable. The others waited, the air thick with something unspoken. Then, finally, he exhaled. "His name is Rex," he murmured. "And he's not just any dog." Emma stepped closer, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Dr. Harris turned the screen slightly, revealing the information on the registry. He was a service dog, military trained. He paused, scanning further. He belonged to a veteran. The weight of those words settled over the room. Emma felt her throat tighten as she looked back at Rex, still struggling to stay upright, his body weak, but his spirit refusing to break. He hadn't just been a stray. He hadn't just been left behind. He had once been someone's lifeline. Dr. Harris kept reading, his expression shifting from confusion to something heavier. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the computer. Emma leaned in, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as the words on the screen sank in. Rex hadn't been abandoned. He hadn't been left to die. He had been lost. 2 years ago, he had been reported missing during a tragic accident. His owner, a retired veteran named Jake Monroe, had been in a serious car crash on a remote road. Witnesses said the car had flipped, rolling into a ditch. Emergency responders had pulled Jake out, unconscious but alive. Rex had been in the car with him, but by the time help arrived, the dog was gone. Search teams had looked for weeks, combing through forests, sending out alerts, hoping he would be found. But he never was. Eventually, he had been presumed dead. His name had faded from records, his story buried under newer cases, newer losses. But somehow, against all odds, he had survived. Alone, injured, wandering through a world that had forgotten him. Emma turned back to Rex, her chest tightening. All this time, he had belonged to someone who had never stopped looking for him. Emma didn't waste a second. She grabbed the phone and dialed the number listed in Rex's file, her hands slightly trembling. The call rang once, twice, then a voice answered. It was rough, tired, like someone who had been carrying the weight of something heavy for far too long. "Jake Monroe?" Emma asked, her voice steady but careful. There was a pause. "Who's asking?" "I'm calling from the Willow Creek Animal Shelter," she said. "It's about your dog, Rex." Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched so long that Emma almost thought the line had gone dead. Then a sharp inhale. A voice barely above a whisper. "Rex?" Emma swallowed. "Yes, sir. He's here." Another pause, this one different. Something in it felt like disbelief, like a man trying to convince himself that what he was hearing wasn't just a cruel trick. When he spoke again, his voice was unsteady. "He's alive." Emma glanced toward the cage, where Rex was lying, watching her with tired but alert eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "He's weak, but he's fighting. I think he's been waiting for someone to find him." The sound that came through the phone wasn't words. It was something else, something raw. A sharp exhale, like someone struggling to breathe. Then, finally, in a voice thick with emotion, Jake said, "I'm coming." The shelter moved quickly after that. Staff members murmured in hushed voices, glancing toward Rex with new eyes. No longer just another stray, no longer just another case. He had a story. He had someone who had never given up on him. Emma sat beside his cage, her heart pounding. Rex had fought to survive, but what if too much time had passed? What if the memories had faded? Would he recognize Jake? Would he react? Or was the bond they once shared too distant, too broken by time and suffering? Hours later, the front doors of the shelter opened, and the room fell silent. A man stood in the doorway, his shoulders tense, his face worn with years of hardship and grief. His hands trembled at his sides as his eyes scanned the room, searching, desperate, and then they landed on Rex. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the man called out, "Rex!" The room held its breath, and so did Emma. Jake took a slow, shaky step forward, his eyes locked on the dog in the cage. His breathing was uneven, like he was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this moment was real. He dropped to his knees, his hands gripping the cold floor as he leaned in closer. His voice, rough and filled with something raw, came out barely above a whisper. "Rex, it's me." The shelter was silent. Emma felt her own heart pounding, waiting, watching. Rex didn't move. His body remained still, his ribs rising and falling with slow, tired breaths. His eyes were open, but there was no reaction, no spark, no sign of recognition. Jake's face fell, his shoulders dropping slightly. He swallowed hard, nodding to himself, as if trying to accept it. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. "I understand." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a second, he just sat there, his hands clenched into fists. The weight of 2 years of loss and grief settled into his features. Then, just as he started to pull back, something happened. A flicker of movement, a shift in tired muscles. Rex's ears twitched. His nose lifted slightly, as if catching a familiar scent, something buried deep in his memory. His body, weak and frail, tense for just a moment. And then, his eyes met Jake's. Everything stopped. Jake didn't move. Emma didn't breathe. Then, with a soft, broken whimper, Rex took a shaky step forward. His legs wobbled, his body trembling from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. His nose pressed against the bars, sniffing, searching, and then, as if something inside him finally clicked, his tail, thin, weak, barely more than a whisper of movement, began to wag. Jake let out a sharp breath, his hands flying to the cage bars. "That's it, buddy. I'm here. I'm right here." His voice was shaking, thick with emotion. Rex let out another whimper, higher this time, filled with something desperate and aching. Then, as if his body had suddenly remembered everything all at once, he pushed forward. His paws scrabbled against the metal, his tail now moving faster, his breathing ragged but full of life. He let out a bark, not strong, not loud, but real. And then the shelter doors were open, and before Emma could even process it, Rex was moving, stumbling, weak but determined, launching himself forward into Jake's waiting arms. Jake caught him, arms wrapping around his frail body, holding him tight, his face buried in the dog's thin fur. His shoulders shook, his grip unbreakable. "I thought I lost you," he choked out. Rex whined, pressing his head against Jake's chest, his body trembling, but not from weakness this time. From relief. From home. Rex didn't leave Jake's side after that. He was still weak, his legs shaky, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat, but something inside him had changed. The fight that had been buried for so long was back. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was trying. Jake stayed at the shelter with him, refusing to leave until Rex was strong enough to come home. Every day, he sat beside him, feeding him small bites of food, encouraging him to drink water. At first, Rex could barely manage a few steps without stumbling, but Jake was patient. He stroked his fur, whispered to him, reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore. And, slowly, Rex began to trust his body again. His tail wagged more often, his ears perked when Jake spoke, and his eyes, once empty and distant, were starting to look alive again. The staff watched the transformation with quiet awe. They had seen rescues before, seen dogs bounce back from impossible situations, but there was something different about this. Rex hadn't just been a lost dog. He had been broken, a shell of what he used to be, and now, against all odds, he was coming back. Emma stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a small smile on her face as she watched Jake run a hand gently over Rex's head. The bond between them was unshaken, untouched by time or distance. 2 years apart, and yet it was like nothing had changed. "He's a fighter," one of the staff whispered. Emma nodded, her chest tightening. "Yeah," she said softly. "He always was." The day Rex left the shelter, the staff gathered near the entrance, watching in quiet disbelief. Just days ago, he had been curled up in a cage, too weak to move, too lost to care. Now he stood beside Jake, still thin, still healing but standing tall. His coat was no longer dull, his eyes no longer empty. There was life in them now, a spark of something that had almost been lost forever. Jake knelt beside him, running a hand over his head. "Ready to go home, buddy?" he murmured. Rex didn't hesitate. His tail wagged, slow but steady, and he leaned into Jake's touch. He didn't look back at the shelter. He didn't need to. The past was behind him now. As they stepped outside, the sun hit his fur, and for the first time in a long time, Rex looked like what he truly was. Not a stray, not a broken dog, a survivor. Rex was one of the lucky ones. He had been given a second chance, a reason to fight, a home to return to. But not every dog gets that. Right now, in shelters all over the world, there are others just like him, waiting, hoping, slowly losing the strength to keep going. Some were abandoned, some were lost, and some were simply unwanted. They sit in cages day after day, watching people walk past, wondering if anyone will ever stop for them, wondering if they will ever matter to someone again. But the truth is, they do matter. Every single one of them deserves a chance, just like Rex did. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to see past the scars, past the fear, past the silence. One person willing to say, "I believe in you." One moment of kindness that can change everything. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. There are shelters filled with dogs waiting for someone to notice them. You could be that person. You can adopt, foster, donate, or simply share their stories. Every small act makes a difference. Subscribe, like, and share this video to spread awareness. Help give another dog like Rex the chance to find their way home. Because sometimes, all they need is for someone to believe they're worth saving.